A century passes. A tapestry of the Hexen coat of arms, a sable field with the points of golden crescent pinching a pearl, hung over the stone throne. The witch queen, Osmara, sat with ankles crossed, fingers woven, and lips pursed. Before her right were gathered a group, geared in full armor. The finer features of their faces were lost to the light pouring through the row of arched windows behind them. Before her left, beyond an intricately carved stretcher table, sat a dozen magnates. Uniformed, the warlocks sported tall leather boots and lyre-pipe hats, and the witches were cinched in brocade corsets. One witch among them, with a long nose and a mop of auburn hair, was flushed with fury at the pace of the proceedings. She had gnawed through her patience as the Duke of Tibrione elaborated on agricultural economics, and her jaw cramped from clenching as the Duchess of Milo bothered the court with foreign gossip under the guise of international relations. With no pretense spent waiting for the court to cede her its attention, she could only bark when she was at last granted her turn. The Duchy of Caldara is barely staving off a plague of fairies. General Eaton's units, presently under my discretion, are insufficient. I am making all of you witness here and now my demand for reinforcements before this pestilence overruns Caldara. What will you have, Osmara? Mind your place or risk your peerage, Myre, Osmara chastised the Duchess's audacity. A plump witch, with an iridescent veil over her dark curls, gently touched the hand of the redhead, then too stood. I must addend to her grace, Lady Myre. Her voice was soft and quaked, as my lands have also had such troubles. Several coastal cities and a druid camp have been swarmed. The crops fail as if the earth were eating every seed that is planted. She struggled to navigate the phrasing, we have even lost a child to changeling. The witches and warlocks seated at the table erupted with disgust at how long the dark-haired witch had waited to announce her plight, and the knights across the room shamed her with their glowering. A tall, bald warlock, standing beside the throne, used the moment of turmoil to lean in and whisper to Osmara's ear. She leaned into his words, granting him a confidence exclusive in the court. The door. Osmara turned her attention to one of the great double doors being slowly opened by a blond soldier attempting a surreptitious late entry. His cape was torn, and his boots were still caked with mud. Osmara commanded silence, and immediately the raging nobles raced back to their respective seats. The queen then granted her full attention to the newly admitted, and everyone else turned to see who it was that had earned such an honor. Taking the cue, the weathered soldier stepped out from behind his commander, approached, and then genuflected before the throne. Your Majesty, I am Arturo, Major to General de Grappe. His Highness, Prince Draco, asked that I make a personal report of a recent ambush to my company near the dwarf city Shechra. Raids by troll bandits have forced us to escort caravans passing through the eastern range. The operations have successfully seen the delivery of tons of goods between the northern duchies. Last week, however, 2 of my escort troops were overwhelmed. The trolls seem to have domesticated the Fae, and the advantage this provided them has cost us 2 highways. At this rate, we risk losing all of our routes between Caldara and Shechra. Domesticate? In what way? Osmara queried. We only know that the troll bandits are organized by a local brute called Marco. Osmara turned a worried gaze to the bald warlock at her side. He leaned in to hear her whisper, Nesu, I cannot begin to express my anticipation for your hypotheses. Nesu's eyes remained fixed on the kneeling soldier as he quipped, and I appreciate your confidence that I have one to share. Osmara took a moment to contemplate, then stood to make her call. All of you, compile your reports, and I shall review them to see how best to allot our military resources. Dame Brian, prepare your soldiers for deployment. By the end of the week, your brigade will be in the eastern range. A woman with flame-orange hair and bronze armor looked shocked at the suggestion. She shoved between 2 others in full-dress armor and prepared to lecture the queen, but lessened the severity of her tone as she neared the throne. Your Majesty, she opened with a delicate formality that did a poor job of masking her frustration. I am delighted to remind you of your designation of the Order of Renelian as escort to the crown. Even my units stationed away from Her Majesty's court are still standing as support to your agents and emissaries. Surely another brigade can serve this honor rather than sever and replace Renelian's relationships. Osmara glared disappointedly at the general. Brienne had not finished her fight, but a warm hand reached out to her shoulder. She looked back at the other generals, whose eyes pleaded with her. Brienne huffed as she turned back to her queen. But your whim is my will. Osmara's pursed lips released to their typical relaxed frown. She turned and exited without a second glance. Nesu followed her out through a small side door. The court rose and bowed for their departure. The bolt had barely landed before Brienne threw a lewd gesture. It earned nothing but gawks from the most genteel of the courtiers across the room. Knuckles rapped on the open door. "Merkener?" Nesu queried. There was no response from the gentleman huddled over his desk, and the silence left only the scratching of his quill to fill the room. He closed his writing with a long stroke, then turned to look over his shoulder at whom had vied for his attention. The bureaucratic handling of his demeanor melted into a jovial smile as he recognized the vizier. "Oh, already?" "My apologies. No, your highness. It is only a minor recess, and Her Majesty anticipates your presence as we reconvene." Merkener scowled, but retired the quill. Shoulder to shoulder they walked down the hall. The knock of their heels against the tile floor was in near synchronous percussion. Nesu kept his head bowed as he leaned into the prince's confidence. "She is absolutely evanescent today, so spare us enough mercy to not attempt winning some antiquated battle." Merkener's distaste for Nesu's condescension was immediately apparent. "If she's finally drawing this session together, then I do not need to win. I have won. Then let us celebrate the silence your victory has brought us." Merkener glowered. "Pity. I had been hoping my victories would warrant a grander celebration. I guess a battle is no bother unless it threatens the family with extinction." Merkener's wit stalled Nesu. They were only one child shy of extinction, and the reminder of that potential glazed the vizier blind to his present. "Nesu, what is it?" Merkener had also had to stop so as not to lose the vizier. Nesu shook himself free of the terrible thought, smiled in apology, and insisted they be on their way. The queen gazed over her territory, unrolled across the large table and meticulously illustrated in soot and scarlet inks. Major Arturo, refreshed and dressed in freshly pressed livery, stood beside the queen and detailed what he knew of the trolls' insurgency. The northern half of the map was populated by obsidian, jade, and ivory figurines. They marched the switchbacks of the western range and bridged the rivers fed by the Druid Falls. They were planted across the fields of Caldara and climbed into the eastern range. "These environments are too varied to be the domain of one fairy princess," Osmara observed. "Perhaps the fairy princesses are colluding," Merkener offered from the other side of the table. Major Arturo disdained. "That does not sound like a fairy tactic I have heard of before." "Fairy tactic," Merkener scoffed. "Certainly not an oxymoron I have heard before." Arturo's want to respond was perplexed by his rank, and this further amused the prince. "Possibilities are not probabilities, your highness," Nesu interrupted the pageantry. "As distillations of nature, the fairy cannot organize, much less cooperate. They are subject to their environment. As the woodland dies in the desert, so too dies the wood elf, and where the desert wind is penned by woods, so too is the barren sylph penned. Find a place where they can cohabitate, and there you can find a fae whom can wield both natures. Allies are not theirs to choose. They merely obey the strongest whim in their fickle environment." Lady Mayore was drained from the chatter that had absorbed her afternoon. "You conceited slaves of your reflections. I have libraries and academics as well. Now close your books and tell me, what are we going to do about the infestation?" "We cannot do anything until we know what the problem is," Osmara doubled down. "And in every moment that we spend distilling a solution, the lay people make their own uneducated conclusions on what the problem really is. There are people in my city who interpret the witch's failure to maintain their obligation as a sign that we have fallen out of favor with the Tawesh. Myre had intended to address the rulings of the court, but her phrasing had tertiary implications to which Osmara latched with an unhealthy zeal. Bearing a daughter was the testament of the Tawesh's complacence with the dynasty of Nir. Gestures of obligation were held in higher esteem than acts of opportunism in the mobile of society. They were suspended by mythological strands, spun theatrically before the fire on cold, useless nights. Without them, all of society would fall, and there would be no difference between obligation and opportunism. Some hoped for a floor, so that after the crash, pieces could be picked up. As a daughter of Nir, Osmara was more inclined to the chaos of an endless freefall, the risk of which hung on the last branch of her family tree, on a branch she had yet to extend. Her failure to bear a daughter was such an obvious example of Myre's myriad suggestions. It had taken Osmara only a moment to come to such an embarrassing conclusion that she was certain it was not far from anyone else's mind. Furthermore, the time she spent ruminating on it only gave them more opportunity to find it. She needed to divert their attention, and quickly. Lady Myre, I could give you an answer right now. Attack the fairies and cut down their numbers. Increase your defenses and keep them out. Abandon your fields and move your people into the cities. However, I trust that you have attempted all of this before requesting my gracious deliverance. Surely you can appreciate the effort invested into your problems, and I am sure that you are doing everything you can to understand how best to use this information to advance your domain. Myre swallowed her persecution, and Osmara holed herself in the silence. Nesu intercepted the conversation. He leaned over the map and began to play the pieces as part of his explanation. Instead of creating a great enemy for which there is no evidence, I suggest that Her Majesty consider the simple possibility that the fairy attacks are the result of a chain reaction of unfortunate events. Consider that over the past 2 decades, drought has caused the Vorsan Desert to expand north toward the valleys around Caldara. As you can all see, Caldara is at the heart of the infested area. Myre smiled, appreciative that someone had finally mentioned her capital city. As the desert moves north, farmers in the region lose their fields and move into more fertile forests to grow their crops. As humans move in, they invite interaction with the fairies, and this accounts for the increase in fairy activity. Meanwhile, troll occupation has never existed south of the Vorsan Desert. For all we know, the trolls have only ever occupied the northern peninsula. Knowing that they have come so far south is alarming. However, if a fairy princess in the region near Tsunami Lagoon had somehow been enticed to aid Brute Marco, then he could use the Fae to move south along the coast, into the eastern range, and all without these terrible pestilences being in any way connected. Osmara shifted in her seat. How did they manage to temper those wild things? And why should the trolls want to move so far south? Merkener perked in his seat. They could take on their old dwarf rivals in Shekra. Succeed there, and they could attack Tarasam. Take both the cities, and that would cut off all land ties to the forests beyond the eastern range. They could hole up there, and then jump the Straits of Taberlion. We could lose counties of cropland. Worry slithered in the imagination of all those involved in the proceedings. Osmara leaned back and ticked her fingernails contemplatively against the table. She looked to a finely dressed fellow with a liripipe hat and said, Inform Lord Terran of the possible dangers to his duchy. Dame Brienne will have soldiers armed and ready to escort you back to Tarasam. Brienne steeled her countenance. That will be her base of action. I want units running regularly between Shekra, Tarasam, and Caldara. Myre beat her lace fan faster and sighed with relief. If you are between Tarasam and Caldara, welcome Brienne and the Order of Renelian as you would welcome me. Provide to them all that they request, as they are the fingers of my hand as it clutches you safely.